Hello, everyone. We're going to give a second for everyone to continue logging in, and we will start in about 1 to 2 minutes. Thank you. Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today for the Colorado Rural Housing Preservation Academy, Session 1, Topic 1, the housing landscape in rural Colorado. Before we begin, I want to go over a couple of housekeeping notes. The webinar is being recorded, so all audience members are muted as they log in. Please use the chat feature to submit questions during the presentation. After the presentation, we will open up lines for Q&A by using the raise hand feature. You'll see that in your chat. We can't visually see you, so raising your hand visually like I just did won't work. We'll have to use that raise hand in the chat. There's a little blue high five hand. All participants will receive a copy of today's webinar recording and the slide deck. And please be patient with us if technical difficulties occur. We're doing our best. We're all in our homes, and so sometimes that happens, and we'll do our best to move on. Adrian, how are we doing with logins? Does it seem like almost everybody's logged in?
Yes, we have 33 attendees.
Awesome. We're really excited to have you all here. I'm Robin Wolf. I work for Enterprise Community Partners. My job is the Senior Program Director for Rural Housing. My team here at Enterprise also consists of Adrian Norwood and Susan Anderson, who is the Director of the Rural and Native American Program team. And then we have our special guests here today joining us, Wendy Hawthorne, the Deputy Director of the Colorado Division of Housing, Connor Everson, analyst at the Colorado Division of Housing as well. Hi, Connor, and Beth Truby from CHAFA. So all of those folks will be speaking. And again, we've got Jenny Rogers, who will be joining us later on some policy updates in the current policy landscape here in the state of Colorado right now. So welcome and introductions. Here's our agenda, the overview of the Colorado housing stock. That will be our friends at the Division of Housing, what we need to be considering across the state related to COVID-19. Jenny Rogers from Enterprise will be providing that. We have planned a break for us, a 5-minute break, just so that everybody can go get their cup of coffee, check their emails, and then be present for that next hour. And then Beth will talk about CHAFA's preservation database, and we'll end with Q&A and wrap up. At that point, again, we can unmute you so you can answer ask your questions live if you're called in, or also you can always use the chat feature for questions. Okay, next slide, Adrian. Enterprise Community Partners is an organization with the vision and mission that one day every person will have an affordable home in a vibrant community filled with promise and the opportunity for a good life. And our mission is to create opportunity for low and moderate income people through affordable housing in diverse and thriving communities. We do that through a series of solutions and capital and policy. So working together, our team is on the solutions side. Jenny has policy and solutions in the Colorado market, and then capital is our loan fund, and then our tax credit syndication. And together that creates a social enterprise that works to promote affordable housing and to ensure safe, decent housing more globally, working toward that goal. Next slide, Adrian. And so that brings us to where we are here at the Colorado Rural Housing Preservation Academy. It's a lot to say. I think we also sometimes add a rental. So Colorado Rental, Rural Rental Housing Preservation Academy. That's even more words. So I'll shorten it to where we are. What we're doing with the Preservation Academy is a series of no-cost training and peer learning sessions designed to help rural housing providers, nonprofits who are working in the rural communities throughout the state to acquire and or preserve affordable housing throughout rural Colorado. And then our ultimate goal of these sessions is to preserve affordable housing options and units for low-income rural populations to the state, and that using a variety of tools related to all sorts, public, private, and new innovations in order to make that happen. We're originally intended to be 7 sessions. We are breaking up this first session into a couple of topical sessions, and we'll likely end up doing the same to deliver the content to you virtually. We will be doing an overview and introduction for rural rental housing and preservation. This is part of that session. USDA Rural Development Transfer Process and Development Rehabilitation. So that's the 515 transfer process to 538. Excuse me. And that will actually be next week or next 2 weeks. So we'll be doing a session every 2 weeks so that for the next 6 weeks. And then we'll take a little bit of pause, and I think we will do another session every 2 weeks, starting again at the end of June. So coming up on May 19th, we will have a 515 preservation and transfer discussion with Philip Dawson from USDA, and also Larry Anderson, who is a consultant who's worked on many 515 to 538 transfers. We'll also be doing preservation financing and deal structuring, supportive policy, a buyer-seller conference, which I am not sure how that will look right now. Not in a virtual session, I think that one will be one that we really want to do in person with you all. Financing and deal structuring part 2, and then some property management conversations, compliance as we work within the structures, and how to handle the transfers and compliance needs that happen in that process. Next slide. Okay, so we're a little bit ahead of time. I think we've got most everybody here. Let me know again if you have any questions in chat. We'll be monitoring chat throughout the call. And with that, we will transfer on over to Wendy and Connor.
Hey everybody, thanks Robin. I am Wendy Hawthorne. I'm the Deputy Director of the Colorado Division of Housing, which is a division in the Department of Local Affairs at the state. I think we can go ahead to the next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a stakeholder engagement process that we led in 2019 and some of the bills that have been passed recently. And then I'll pass it over to Connor Everson, who'll dig a little more into the data for the rural regions across the state. So 2019 was really a historic legislative session for housing. There were 2 really significant bills passed, 1322 and 1245, which added significant funds for affordable housing development in the state. There were 2 sources of the funds. One is the vendor fee, which is a portion of sales tax that instead of going to some of the larger businesses, it would come back to the state to fund affordable housing into the future. And that was a real sustainable type of funding that would provide a significant amount. They estimated around $47 million a year for affordable housing, which is just a huge bump to what we normally were getting for affordable housing. And then 1322 was unclaimed assets. That was a potential for $30 million a year for 3 years. So these sources of funding could potentially triple the funds that Division of Housing and Department of Local Affairs would have available for acquisition and rehab and new construction of affordable units. And we provide that funding in grants and loans to nonprofits, local governments, housing authorities to enable them to close deals for affordable housing. Those bills also provided us with staffing to provide a lot more technical assistance, especially in rural Colorado, to be able to have our development specialists work with communities to really figure out what deals could be made, how to do it, how to put the financing together. Now, that being said, COVID-19 has added uncertainty to these funding streams for the next few years. The state does have, projected huge budget shortfall, and that's being sorted out right now. But we're hopeful that even, if some of that money isn't available for the next few years, that it will come back to us because it is in law. One that I described, the vendor fee depends on sales taxes. So we've obviously seen a big drop in sales over the last few months, and so we don't know how that will impact it. You can go to the next slide. Also, those bills added some specific language around rural housing to how the Division of Housing would utilize those funds. Previously, there was nothing in our statutes that prohibited us really from doing these things, but by adding it to the statute, it was very clear that the legislators wanted us to focus on some of these items. So it added that we could use the funds for development of for sale housing in non-urban areas for households earning up to 120% of the area median income. And we had been hearing that for quite a while, that our normal range of serving people up to 80% of the area median income just wasn't working for rural areas. In Eastern Plains areas, that 80% AMI was just too low to be able to afford a home. And in some of our rural resorts, 80% AMI just didn't get, and there was no product available for people. So this bill kind of pushed that limit for us. Also increased the down payment assistance products for households up to 100% AMI. It named home rehabilitation programs, which is something we have always funded, but again, by naming it in the bill, it kind of put some priority on it. It talked about repair, replacement, and disposal of mobile homes, as well as using some of those funds for land acquisition and infrastructure costs for housing. Our goal on the technical assistance side, we have regional staffing who each have a region of the state, and several of them are located in rural areas, that we would be able to increase our regional staffing. So split the state up a little bit more and have more of that technical support out in those communities. You can go to the next slide. Another thing House Bill 1322 did was that it required Division of Housing to consult with stakeholders from rural and urban communities, representatives from populations of differing incomes, and representatives from populations with diverse housing needs, to help us determine how to best utilize those funds. So of all those different allowable uses, how are we going to use it? How are we going to get it out to the community? How are we going to possibly set up new programs? So I'm going to go to the next slide. So in 2019, we held quite a large stakeholder engagement process. We engaged 868 stakeholders from almost every county in the state. I actually can't see the key. The blue stars and the red stars are where we held those various meetings, and we reached, you can see the darker colors is where we reached more people. The only representatives we didn't have were in the counties there that are highlighted in gray. So we heard from a lot of people on a lot of issues, and our main thing that we were asking people was, what are your greatest unmet needs in your communities, and how would you solve those needs? So we heard a lot of really interesting ideas and from a lot of different perspectives on the need. You can go to the next slide. Common themes across the state, and Connor will talk more about the themes we heard in specific rural regions, but across the state, we heard affordable housing is a huge challenge everywhere. There was no part of the state where people thought, oh, it's not a big deal for housing. We heard that there was a big need for missing middle, which is that housing for maybe 80% to 120% AMI, that there just wasn't product there for people, and a big problem with workforce housing all across the state. Then we also heard we needed tailored solutions for populations with specific barriers to obtaining housing. So say seniors and people with disabilities, people who've lived with homelessness, veterans. Basically, we heard from people that we need it all across the state. There was not really one sector or type of housing that didn't come out as a high priority for somewhere in the state. We did hear a lot about mobile home parks, that they're disappearing or becoming unaffordable. And that's been a longstanding kind of natural affordable housing for us in the state. It's not subsidized generally, but it does provide options for people. So that loss is really concerning. And we heard a lot about that NIMBYism, so not in my backyard ism, and zoning are hindering affordable housing development across the state, where there could be a good idea, there's land available, but they just can't get it through their city government or with the people who live there. Go to the next slide, please. So actually I'm going to hand it off to Connor Everson now. He's going to talk a little more about specific data in the rural regions, as well as some of the themes we heard around in these specific rural regions. So Connor.
Hey, Connor, you're on mute.
Oh, can you hear me now? I was having trouble taking this off of mute.
Nope, you're great. We hear you great.
Okay, perfect. Okay, hi, also I'm Connor Everson, a data and policy analyst at the Division of Housing as well. If I seem kind of far away from the webcam or my eyes buzzing around the screen, it's because I have a desktop computer, so it's a little bit of a different setup. But how we're gonna do this portion is I'm just gonna kind of breeze through some indicators of kind of rural Colorado overall, and then we'll kind of delve into the different regions as we've divided them, and also the kind of stakeholder engagement findings that we had. So the Division of Housing has bucketed Colorado into 5 regions, and for the purposes of this presentation, we've excluded the Front Range specifically. And this slide really touches on the housing cost trends for those remaining 4 regions. And it's looking at the percent, not the percent, but the number of households that pay more than half of their income towards rent by AMI. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this already, but this cost burden, particularly the severe cost burden, has the largest impact on extremely low income households at and below 30% AMI, and also to a lesser extent for very low income households at 30 to 50% AMI. And this really holds true across all of the regions. There's a huge impact for those folks, and really just imagine what it's like when you've got only maybe $1,000 left after you've paid your rent for the month, for all of your other expenses, from healthcare to just groceries, food, and childcare as well. It doesn't go a very long way, especially in some more expensive parts of rural Colorado. And an interesting trend that we see is that a larger portion of the households that experience this severe cost burden do live in the rural resort region, which includes counties like Eagle and Summit, or the Western Slope, which includes counties like Garfield or Mesa. And we're gonna see the maps for these in just a bit here. And there's, oh, can we go back actually one slide? I'm not ready just yet. And those more expensive counties do have a higher portion of their 80% and 100% AMI residents that are cost burden, but still we really see the highest number at the lowest income levels. And okay, now can we do the next slide, please? Okay, so housing problems. We often talk about housing cost as an issue, but there's other housing problems as well. So there's a HUD data set that we use to get some great insight into this issue. And as you can see across the chart, regardless of the region, housing cost is the most widespread issue. And there's still issues of overcrowding, so that can be caused either by one family living in a housing unit that's not quite large enough, or even from multiple unrelated families living in a single housing unit as well. So our friends at the Shift Research Lab did a really great study on that last year, and I really encourage folks to take a look at that. It's an interesting look at a housing issue that isn't explored very often. And another thing that we think is very pertinent, especially for rural areas, is structural problems, which you can see in orange on this chart, the kind of darker orange. But I will say it's really kind of tough to get data on structural problems. How the US Census Bureau measures this is housing units that have inadequate or incomplete plumbing or kitchen facilities. So that's maybe not the most suitable measure, but that's really what we have. And there's some parts of the state we know are especially lacking in terms of housing quality. And this may be even larger on the single family side of things. But we don't have the best data to look at that. But on the next slide, one of the things that we can use to kind of get a perspective on this is the age of housing stock. So it's our assumption that a lot of the older units, especially in rural areas that are built before 1960, may not be in the best condition. And this is a kind of a proxy measure that we can use, especially when a lot of these federal data sets focus more so on urban areas, because it's just easier from a kind of infrastructure perspective to get data in urban areas. But anyways, a kind of interesting thing is that this chart where we're looking at rental stock, it's actually pretty similar to some older urban counties like Denver County. So the distribution of this chart is kind of fairly similar to Denver. But what's also interesting is that the rental stock in rural areas is much older than some suburban counties like Douglas County. In Douglas County, 94% of their rental units were built after 1979. So if we could go to that next slide as well. And if we look at just kind of the distribution of the rental stock in rural Colorado, kind of looking at that balance between multifamily developments with more than 4 units, or single family developments where I kind of lump duplexes as well. This distribution is similar to the state as a whole, but I really like to draw your attention to the height of that multifamily bar in rural Colorado, and kind of keep in mind that there is many ways to define rural areas, and there's no kind of perfect right way to do it. But what's kind of worth knowing from our perspective is I put Grand Junction as a rural area for our purposes in general. So Grand Junction is a lot of those multifamily units, but even if you look at all of those multifamily units in rural Colorado, that's 60,000 units. And for the calculations that I have done, for every 1 housing unit that is preserved in a rural area, it's as if you were preserving 10 units in an urban area. So every unit that we can preserve really makes a huge difference in the grand scheme of things in the rural areas. And now on the next slide, where we're finally getting into our kind of a breakdown of these regions and how this is going to work, is I'm going to kind of open up each region with the data that I've come up with and think is interesting. And then I will present the findings from our stakeholder engagement as well. So the Central Mountains, the kind of data themes that I take away is that compared to some other parts of rural Colorado, this region is fairly affordable, but has some unique economic challenges. So as the prices in the resort counties rise, some of the Central Mountains have become very notable homes for commuters. For example, an estimated 81% of all workers in Lake County actually work outside of Lake County in 2017. I think that's just very, very interesting. That's a huge portion of residents, and that's very different from other rural counties and even urban ones as well. So even though the Central Mountains tend to be more affordable than other counties like, say, Summit County or Pitkin, there's some fairly significant challenges of poverty, especially in the southern part of this region. So there are 6 counties in the Central Mountains where there is a poverty rate that is twice as high as the state average. So that means that 20% of households are in poverty in those areas. And the federal data providers, like I said earlier, don't really provide super excellent data on housing quality, but it's our understanding that there is some deteriorating housing, especially on the single family side, from reports from our grantees who rehab single family homes and even Colorado Public Radio. There seems to be some very concentrated areas in this region where there's makeshift housing and folks that have little to no public services and infrastructure. And on the next slide, we jump into the stakeholder engagement from this region. So that the stakeholders really highlighted that there is a major gap for affordable housing for folks that are between 30% and 80% AMI. So I think that's quite interesting because of the sparse population of this region, and there's not a ton of tax credit developments. And also the stakeholders shared that there is a lack of affordable housing kind of in a general sense, which really makes it difficult for employers to find and retain their workers. But they also cited the importance of the programs that already exist there, such as weatherization and single family emergency rehab programs. And they were excited about the opportunity to have funding for capacity building to do even more work in the future. On the next slide, we look at the Eastern Plains. So what's very interesting from a data perspective are 2 things as I see it: a sparse population and an old housing stock. So when you look at the age of housing stock across all 64 counties in the state of Colorado, the 10 counties with the oldest housing stock are all in the Eastern Plains. In fact, for Sedgwick County specifically, the median year that housing was built in Sedgwick County is 1947. So that means that half of all housing units in Sedgwick were built even before then. And another thing that really characterizes this region is a sparse population. So most of these counties have less than 1,000 rental units total. And out of the entire region, an estimated 1,500 rental units were built since 2000. So a very limited development in recent years. There's many suburban and urban areas that have more development in just the past few years, much less since the year 2000. And to hop into the next slide on our stakeholder themes. So the stakeholders noted that the Eastern Plains is particularly categorized by its remote rural location. Of course, this can apply to many areas, but they thought it was important to highlight that the distance to construction materials and contractors can result in high construction costs. And also infrastructure costs just to kind of build out new greenfield areas can add a lot to projects. And several stakeholders shared that the cost to build a new home can be more than its appraised value, which really leads to issues on the single family side. And another common theme was the limited capacity of smaller towns, and that they struggle with matching requirements and are unable to offer financial incentives to developers just due to the kind of the scale and issues of kind of small town budgets. And one of the things that was really especially interesting for us is that the stakeholders were really eager to entice people to move to the Eastern Plains, especially for growing families and aged adults. And one of the very salient parts about the Eastern Plains is the geography is very developable. So the land is higher, it's more abundant, and generally cheaper to develop. One stakeholder shared, we have the space and land to develop. We need support in advertising and linking the developers to the community. They welcome development in general. And our next slide, we are going to touch on what we call the rural resort region. So this includes many counties that either host notable ski areas or are in proximity to, and where tourism is a especially significant part of their economy. And the data themes that really jump out to me are, of course, high housing costs and constrained markets. So about this time last year, when I was doing some research for a conference, I was looking at the housing markets of this region. I was using a federal data set on mortgages, and I thought, you know what, these mortgages for counties like Eagle and Summit look fairly expensive, but it doesn't seem as bad as I would expect. And then what kind of jumped out to me after I look at the Realtor Association's website is there are so many folks that are buying homes in this region for cash that it's skewing the numbers. I think that there is a double-digit percentage of homes being bought for cash in these counties, which is very interesting. But that, as you can kind of see on the screen as well, impacts the rental market as well. It's tough to get especially timely and accurate data on rental markets, and we always try our best, but it's our understanding that the rural resort region is the most expensive rental market in the state, even compared to Denver Metro. Maybe it's right up there with Boulder. But the home ownership market also skews that rental market upwards as well. And we expect that much of this cost is due to the limited land available for development. So kind of the opposite problem of the Eastern Plains areas. there's a FHFA data set, which suggests that in a single acre of residential land costs $3 million in Pitkin County, and is still substantial, but lower $1 million in San Miguel. So that's just the land, not even the cost of the structure on the land. So that causes issues for market rate development, much less affordable housing development, which is why it's especially important to preserve the affordable housing that already exists in this rural resort region. And that really ties into, on the next slide, our stakeholder themes from the rural resort region. So as Wendy noted, a lot of folks are very concerned about the housing gap in the rural resort county and how that goes all the way up to 200% AMI in some areas. Another theme was second homeowners that occupy the limited housing stock, and how this could potentially drive up housing prices for residents and workers, which can result in long commute times, like I was talking about earlier with Lake County in the Central Mountains. And one kind of case was a stakeholder who drove 62 miles in each direction, and how that creates a drive until you can afford it sort of community. One stakeholder wrote that we need a variety of housing types and price points to meet the needs of our community. We're a rural community with rural resources, but big city housing issues. And now we're gonna breeze on through our very last region here on the next slide with the Western Slope. So this includes still some counties where tourism is a very important employer, but also oil and gas extraction. But what really jumps out to me for the Western Slope in terms of kind of data themes is growing population and growing costs. So our state demography office, if you're not familiar with them, they do a lot of very important, interesting, and salient work. And one of their ongoing projects is household projections by county across the state. And they project that by 2050, the counties of Montrose will grow by 65%, Mesa by 57%, and La Plata by 56% by 2050. So there is a significant amount of population growth in a lot of Western Slope counties, especially compared to the Eastern Plains and some of the Central Mountains, where population is actually declining. But even compared to the metro area, where population is still growing, but not quite as fast. And this is causing some cost issues, and we suspect that's combined with kind of cyclical resource powered economy, which has caused housing troubles for this region in the past as well. And we've got my last slide next on the stakeholder themes in the Western Slope area. So the stakeholders highlighted that it is most impacted by its remote location and short building season, which makes development difficult. This is something that we've seen in our own work, and we've seen some innovative projects that really take advantage of interesting methods to mitigate that short building season. And again, kind of like the other high cost regions, the stakeholders noted that there is a challenge of the missing middle and workforce housing, where there's a long distance between the homes of residents and where they're working because of the price point of rental and for sale housing. And there is low paying jobs and student debt burden that can make it difficult to qualify for loans, further kind of stressing the rental market as well, when maybe folks could afford a home, but there is financial challenges that prevent that. There's challenges of out-migration as well. And interestingly, on the kind of affordable housing program side, it sounds like an issue is there's a large number of voucher holders that are porting out of the Western Slope and moving to the Denver metro area because they're unable to find a market rate unit within their allotted time frame for the Housing Choice Voucher Program, which also causes out-migration. And they asked for additional vouchers and kind of reframed program requirements for that reason. And then we're on the next slide, which I think Wendy will be tackling.
Thanks, Connor. I'll just wrap this up, kind of what our next steps are, where we are with all of this. So as I mentioned earlier, the fiscal year 21 state budgeting process is underway right now. And, you know, given the COVID situation, there is a great budget shortfall at the state. So we'll see how that works out for affordable housing. We should know in a few weeks. And at the same time, you know, with the packages from the federal government, there are some emergency federal funds coming for housing, as well as there were some emergency state funds put towards emergency rental and mortgage payments. So we've just stood up that program, our emergency housing assistance program. We have 18 agencies across the state that are able to provide emergency rental and mortgage payments to low-income families. And we expect that the state executive order that put that into place allows that to go till about mid-September. But potentially will, if that is a great need, we'll be able to utilize some of the federal funds for that type of program as well. And then these ESG, CDBG, HAPWA are other federal grants that are specifically for the use of for use on housing projects. So we're just learning more about those programs and the amounts of funds we're getting for those and what they can be used for, and you know, what are the greatest needs during this emergency situation. Finally, the stakeholder outreach engagement process we led, we heard a lot from stakeholders about wanting to have an ongoing working group to help the Division of Housing look at specific problems or needs, or how to spend the new funds that we have. So we are standing up a strategic housing working group. Applications are due June 19th. This is the website here. I'm sure we can share that with the whole group, or this will be shared with people, but we encourage people to apply for that if you're interested in staying engaged in this process. And we do have several spots on that working group specifically for people who can bring the rural perspective. So that's it for me. I think next slide is just our contact information. And we're happy to take questions, or you can reach out to either one of us after this event. So thank you.
Yes, thank you, Wendy and Connor, both. That's a lot to unpack and really wrap our heads around. It looks like Steve Cordova from Total Concept submitted a question. We are seeing more issues related to environmental concerns, lead-based paint, asbestos, and older stock with low values and high cost of remediation or abatement that makes using the existing programs difficult. What type of potential solutions do you guys see exist or are planned to help address those beyond brownfields or with matching concerns?
Mm-hmm. Okay, sure, I can try to take that. Hi, Steve. We do hear that, and we've heard more and more about asbestos being a problem in our rural communities, especially in the Eastern Plains. And as Steve knows, and he's probably referring to, is we've traditionally utilized federal funds for our housing rehab programs, and using federal funds comes with a lot of requirements, specifically around lead-based paint, which I think are important regulations for protecting young children from lead-based paint. There is a possibility with the new funds, if depending on the budget, hopefully we will get those funds eventually, to utilize state funds for those purposes, which might make things a little bit easier or be a little more flexible in cases where that makes sense, and possibly to use those funds for asbestos remediation as well. So I think that's part of the stakeholder engagement. We heard about that and about that working group too. So Steve, it would be great to put in an application for that. We'd love to hear from you more. So.
Great, thanks for answering that for us, Wendy. Now we're going to talk to Jenny Rogers. Jenny Rogers is the Vice President Market Leader for the Denver/Colorado market here at Enterprise Community Partners, and she is one of my colleagues. We share an office when we are in our offices. So Jenny is going to speak to us a bit about the policy implications in the current kind of environment with COVID-19. Thanks, Jenny.
Thanks, Robin. So I think Wendy and Connor did a great job of highlighting housing needs from across the state, and definitely showing why preservation is such an important strategy for meeting housing needs, considering the challenges we have in housing the people who are cost burdened, our construction challenges, et cetera. And I think what we found is that COVID-19 just exacerbates the need for housing interventions. We need people to be healthy and to stay in place. If not now, we definitely, need to really think now about how we preserve our housing stock in rural Colorado. So I just wanted to go through a little bit, considering the world that we have been living in the last couple months, and the stresses that this has put on our partners and our population. We wanted to give a little bit of an update on policy that's related to COVID, both at the national and the state level. So if you want to go to the next slide. As I'm sure you all know and may have heard on some of the phone calls that we've been hosting over the last few months, the CARES Act was passed in March, I think, and guidelines on the CARES Act have started to flow in April and into May. And so, as Wendy mentioned, the state of Colorado and some of our participating jurisdictions are getting federal resources to deal with COVID impacts. Some of those impacts, as you all are acutely aware, are increased operating costs for our nonprofit rental housing providers, costs associated with increased pay for employees, providing additional services to residents, cleaning buildings, making sure buildings are safe and secure, et cetera. And so the federal government in the CARES Act has been providing a variety of resources to deal with those and other costs. The Division of Housing, the City of Denver, and other participating jurisdictions are getting CDBG CV funds and additional emergency solutions grant funding. I believe that DOH, and Wendy can correct me if I'm wrong, has already received their first tranche of emergency solutions grant funds. They will be getting $7.3 million. And there are 2 more tranches of funding coming to states in the future. The allocations of those and the amounts that will come to each state are not known yet. Those funds can be used to support shelter operations and homeless solutions, including up to 24 months of rental assistance. And the Division of Housing has acted quickly. And I think if I'm correct from Wendy's updates last week, the first contracts for shelter operations have been sent out. For CDBG, the first tranche is available to states and participating jurisdictions now. States and PJs have to submit a plan to HUD for how they're going to use all of these new funds that are coming to them. And so the state and other PJs are in the process of creating those plans. The plans are being fast-tracked, and the public input process has been shortened from 30 days to 5. So we'll be looking for those draft plans as they roll out, and you certainly can provide input on them as you see them. The nice thing about the CDBG CV is that HUD has lifted some of the requirements, including a 15% cap on something called public services. So programs including housing counseling, tenant-based rental assistance, and other supports can be paid for in a higher percentage of the CDBG funds. As I said, HUD's going to be releasing these funds in waves, in 3 tranches. They expect the allocation for the second tranche, those allocation amounts, to be announced in another week or so. And then the third tranche will be on a rolling basis based on COVID cases and COVID impacts. Unclear exactly how much Colorado will get for either of those tranches. The nice thing about another nice thing about the next waves of CDBG funds is that while the first tranches flow as other CDBG funds do, based on population, and for instance, the state of Colorado can spend those dollars outside of the jurisdictions that get their own CDBG allocations. The next one that the state will get will be available statewide, and not just in those unincorporated areas or non-entitlement areas. So next slide. That's a little bit of information about funds that have been coming through the CARES Act. There are also, as some of you may know, supports for housing authorities, for some of the rental assistance programs that we have, including 811 and 202 properties. But two of the things that were really missing in the first CARES Act and that we are advocating for in the second CARES Act, there was no supplemental allocation of home funds. Enterprise and many of our partners are advocating for $48 billion in additional home appropriations in the CARES 2 Act. And there was also no support, which is especially crucial for many of you, for USDA rural housing services programs. So you can see on this slide, we are also advocating for the inclusion of USDA supports in the second CARES Act. That includes $300 million for short-term operating costs, emergency staffing, et cetera, a 1-year moratorium on debt or mortgage payments to RD, $700 million for rental assistance in all multifamily properties financed through rural housing services, $100 million for permanent service coordinator positions at each property, and $250 million in one-time $1,000 per unit grants to owners to help with some of those costs we talked about for deep cleaning. We also have some additional requests into HUD. Those include additional allocations of CDBG and additional allocations of Section 4 technical assistance funding. Enterprise is one of 3 grantees nationally that gets those funds, and we push most of that through to grantees across the state of Colorado. And Wendy just let me know that DOH has your award letter for ESG, but doesn't have the funds yet. So they are surveying shelters and getting a sense of their emergency shelter needs. Thank you for that clarification, Wendy. We heard yesterday the Senate is going back to Washington, D.C. The House is set to come back on May 11th. The CARES 2 Act is being drafted by the House and has many housing supports in it, including, on the next slide, we can talk a little bit about the low-income housing tax credit program, which also was not included in the first CARES Act. And the Senate has yet to weigh in and start to work with the House on this bill. So what the House and the Democrats in the House are proposing may change significantly before a final bill. The action campaign that Enterprise is part of is also advocating, along with housing finance agencies and many other partners, for some modifications to the low-income housing tax credit program. Especially in emergency action, this is our top priority, that would enact a minimum 4% rate for buildings that are placed in service after January 20th, 2020. As you may have heard, the financial markets are causing that, that low-income housing tax credit rate to go very low to, I think, 3.12% or 3.08% were some of the last numbers that I heard, which is stressing out the financials on new developments. So what we are advocating for is a minimum 4% rate. We're also advocating for a few other modifications to the program, additional immediate relief, economic recovery relief, and an additional basis boost to help developments access additional equity if needed for financial feasibility. So we're really hoping that these modifications to the tax credit program will be included in the second CARES Act. If you want to go to the next slide. So on the state level, as Wendy mentioned, the governor did allocate $3 million in emergency housing assistance. I believe that was right at the end of March. That funding is flowing through DOLA and the Division of Housing. $2 million in that emergency housing assistance, as Wendy mentioned, is being granted to 18 organizations statewide to provide emergency rent and utility, or emergency rent and mortgage assistance. $1 million is being set aside and is being allocated for other emergency needs. The legislature started to reconvene yesterday, and the first 2 weeks are being, the focus is with the JBC on the budget. As I'm sure you've heard, we are looking at budget cuts this year and into the future. There's an estimated $3 billion hit that will come next year. And so the JBC and the Office of State Budget and Planning are working together to figure out both how to cut the budget and how to reduce costs next year. In the next 2 weeks, the JBC will be having hearings each day on different departments. And as it happens on Friday, the 8th, the Department of Local Affairs, which includes the Division of Housing, will be discussed. And while we were very successful and are very excited about our 2 new housing resources for Colorado that we all worked very hard to advocate for, the unclaimed properties tax funds that are estimated at about $30 million and we thought would be in the budget in 2021 are on the list of funds to help relieve that $3 billion gap, as well as possibly the vendor fee revenue that was our other new resource. So if you are interested in advocating to keep some or of those funds in the state budget, this is the week to do that advocacy outreach. Also, the governor strengthened the moratorium on evictions just last week, and new restrictions are in place through May. And if you have not heard about this or read the detail, you can look at the executive order. The order says that there should be no filings or initiation of action for forcible entry and detainer based on a tenant's inability to pay rent. There should be no removal of tenants or possessions placed based on inability to pay, no late fees or penalties for breaking the terms of a lease based on non-payment for the duration of the order. And any of the properties that have some of the federal protections against eviction must notify their tenants of this protection. And DOLA and the Division of Housing is creating a model repayment agreement that landlords can use to allow tenants additional time to repay their rents. So that was a huge win that we heard about last week. And thank you to our partners at the state and for all of you across the state for advocating for that. That may be in my slides. Let's look at the next slide. Yes, so if you are interested in keeping up to date on policy from across the state and across the country as the House and the Senate start to reconvene, you can visit Enterprise COVID website. We also have a Colorado COVID resource page for Enterprise. And I've listed a few other good sites to keep up on advocacy and information. And the Division of Housing is also doing a great job of keeping track. So you can visit their website as well. And I'm happy to answer any question.
Thank you, Jenny. If you have any questions, again, submit them in the chat, or we will be unmuting you at the end of the call. I do want to honor a break that we have written in. I did have one question for, I think it's for Wendy, but as we see the budget allocations that we're going to be the additional dollars in housing in flux, what ways are you looking at as we're replacing those dollars with CDBG or ESG, or if we're able to continue to supporting housing with those dollars, how do we continue to make sure that there's a distribution of those funds in rural communities?
You know, we're still waiting. We have received a few award letters on these new funds. As Jenny was saying, the ESG around 7 million and CDBG, but we're still waiting for some guidance about what they can be utilized for exactly. And we get normal allocations, regular allocations in a regular year of those as well. So kind of looking at the whole picture of what can these special CV funds be used for, what is the greatest need? I mean, because those are really intended for the emergency and recovery from the emergency. And then how can we utilize our kind of regular funds as well? So it's all just right now a little bit of a moving picture. It's like we get new information every day on some of these things. So, you know, I think even though that stakeholder engagement was specific around the new funds, of course, we're going to utilize that going forward for everything. You know, we got a lot of great input, and we'll be utilizing that to make best use of the funds and make sure. And rural areas have always been a priority in the sense of wanting to have the technical assistance out there and making sure that we can get good projects from rural communities.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I know everything's in flux right now, so it's we can't commit in hard ways to anything at this point, as we're all sort of trying to figure out what the new steady state will be. I also wanted to let you know, in addition to the Colorado resource page for COVID-19, there is a rural and native programs page on the enterprise website as well. And then also the Healthier Colorado and Colorado Health Foundation sponsors the Colorado Rural Preservation Academy as well, has done a great survey of just, I would say residents of Colorado. I think 1,400 people throughout the state, including rural communities, and really kind of just seeing what the impact of COVID-19 has been on those communities. And for those of us who are housers, there was some really good data about income reflections, what's happening with incomes, what's happening, I think, with mental health, which is something we need to think about, and then also what's happening in terms of income distribution, who's being hardest hit. So I'll send out a link via chat so that you can look at that. we're gonna have a 5-minute break, so it's 11:03 according to my clock. So we can come back at 11:08, and I will see you. Beth, you will start promptly at that point. Thank you very much. See you in just a bit. Okay, we have 1 minute. Hello, everyone. Please remember to type in questions via chat. We had so much good data in that first hour, and I want to make sure you do have your questions ready. Adrian, if you can put Beth's splash slide on, that'd be great. And as a blue, enterprise blue blank slide is a little dreary. I want to welcome Beth Truby. Beth Truby is at CHAFA and is leading CHAFA's preservation work and is going to talk to us a little bit about preservation and why it's important, I think, overall, and then also about what CHAFA is doing specifically in the realm of preservation and CHAFA's preservation database, which I think at some point all of us will be really interested in taking deeper look at as we move forward with the Rural Preservation Academy in our communities. So Beth, take it away.
Thanks, Robin, appreciate it. So definitely glad to be with everybody this morning, and we can go ahead and go to the first main slide, the next slide. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with CHAFA, but I did want to start out just sharing a little bit about us. We do provide loans to developers. We allocate the low-income housing tax credits for the state. We do have a business lending program, and we also support homebuyer education and loan programs for homeownership. And CHAFA is actually a quasi-governmental entity. We were established by the legislature in 1973, but we actually don't receive any funding from the state of Colorado or any governmental entity. I mean, we do get the allocation of tax credits, but we generate all the income, the revenue for programs that we do from the programs that we do, and grants and things like that. Next slide, please. So again, I wanted to briefly share what the magnitude of our investment was. You can see here in 2019, what we invested around the state was over $3 billion. So a pretty big chunk of change. The vast majority of that went to support homeownership, but you can see almost $3 billion. But we also made substantial investments in affordable rental housing lending and business and nonprofit lending as well. And we've been talking a lot about COVID this morning. We have been making some additional investments during this time of COVID. We've already provided this year about $500,000 to nonprofits around the state, and particularly those that are providing immediate support to those that have been affected by the COVID. We are continuing to keep our loan programs going, down payment assistance going, and we've been actively working with lenders to try and help streamline those processes as well. And of course, our asset management division, they're not going out and doing inspections and things like that anymore. So we've modified some of our on-site inspection and compliance review process at this time. And we're also, there's some of the funds that are coming from the state and elsewhere, some private firms. We are partnering with the state OEDIT, the Office of Economic Development, to expand some of these programs available to small businesses. Next slide, please. So I wanted to drill down. Oops, did we go one slide too many? Oh, looks like there's a missing slide. Is my pyramid there? There it is. The pyramid, the affordable housing stock pyramid. So I wanted to share just a little bit what kind of inventory is available for people who need something more affordable. And the figures are a little bit dated, but I think they're pretty good about showing the magnitude and the type of the affordable housing stock that's available. You can see here, there's about 11.6 million units of affordable housing stock. And about 1.2 million of those are owned by housing authorities. Then there's almost 2 million that have been primarily assisted over the years by HUD and USDA. Of course, they're privately owned, but they have received in the past, or they currently receive, some sort of financial incentive. So that may include below market interest rates, or interest rate subsidies, or rent subsidies, and then exchange from that commitment from property owners that yes, they will keep the apartments affordable to low income households for whatever period of time they've agreed to. And then since the low-income housing tax credits, the LIHTC program was put in place in the 80s, in the 1980s, there have been about 3 million LIHTC units placed in service. And then you can also see that the largest affordable inventory really is that 5.5 million of unsubsidized affordable rental units, or that naturally occurring affordable housing. Next slide, please. So I think we need to go back to, because somehow they got mixed up. There we go. So I wanted to, again, drill down on the subsidized affordable housing stock a little bit more. And what is happening with that subsidized housing stock. You can see from some of those the slide that Connor showed earlier, just what we're calling out here on this slide. The construction rates for that subsidized housing has really decreased dramatically since that mid-1970s peak. You know, there may have been up to 300,000 units being produced annually in the 70s, and now we're more in the 75 to 100,000 range across the country. So, and in the past decade, we've really lost more than 1 million affordable housing units lost. And since we really started looking at this in 2015, 2016, and we were looking at that period 10 years out, 2015 to 2025, just in that 10-year period, the affordable use periods for about 2.2 million of those privately owned units that were financed or subsidized with the federal and local resources, those affordable use periods are going to be expiring by 2025. And just to give you an idea of what's going on in Colorado, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute, there's approximately 1,400 subsidized properties with about 70,000 affordable units in them. Next slide, please. Perfect. So that we all know escalating demand is driving rents up. The new housing stock being built that's not subsidized is often unaffordable. We're not building enough subsidized housing, and that supply of existing subsidized housing stock is decreasing. So all of this together is really resulting in the situation that we're in today with the greatly diminished affordable housing inventory. As we said a minute ago, a lot of these contracts or deed restrictions that are guaranteeing subsidized housing, they're expiring or they're going to soon expire. And the owner's going to be able to exit the program if they desire, and then, of course, convert that property to a non-affordable use. I wanted to mention that LIHTC started in the 1980s, but originally had just a 15-year affordability period. The LIHTC program went to the minimum 30-year affordability period in the early 90s. So those properties, that restrictions that were the 30 years, the first time they had the 30-year restriction, well, 2021 is really that 30-year time that they're starting to expire. So we're going to be having a lot of tax credit properties starting to expire starting in 2021. So this really is a big issue. Of course, the owners in higher rent neighborhoods that have these properties with below market rents, they have the most incentive to opt out naturally when the restrictions expire. But the properties in weaker markets, they might not have enough revenue, operating revenue, to maintain that property and to keep it from deteriorating. And the owners may not have the capacity or the interest to participate in these programs anymore, be able to recapitalize, or they may want just out of this business and not in the program anymore. So as we all know, these aging properties, they're in need of major repairs, they need financial investment, and they may not have enough reserves to do that. They likely don't. And with the current COVID crisis situation that we're in, that's going to be just putting new pressures on this existing affordable housing stock, further hampering reserves or cash flows or other issues. So regardless, as units lose their affordability restrictions, we either need to replace them or keep them affordable, or the problem will continue to get worse. Next slide, please. So what is preservation? And given these pressures, preservation has really gained momentum. It's really a cost-effective approach for trying to ensure that ongoing availability of affordable housing. So preservation, that just means, hey, we're going to take some action to ensure those low-income restrictions remain in place, maybe recapitalize, bring some new resources, and ensure that long-term affordability is being maintained. So even if a property isn't truly at risk of being lost as subsidized housing, it likely needs to be upgraded, it likely needs some repairs to extend its life and maintain those decent and safe living conditions. So new capital is almost always needed. And if the existing owner doesn't have interest in continuing, or there's owner capacity issues, then hopefully we can transfer that property to an owner more committed to continuing that long-term affordability. Next slide, please. Or should I just beep, Adrian, when we're ready to go? Beep. No. Well, what are the benefits of preservation? It's very cost effective. It can cost a half to up to even 2/3 less than building a new building. And as we said, those properties need rehab, so you can bring some energy and resource saving features, reducing your energy costs, reducing your maintenance costs. We don't need new land, we don't need rezoning, we don't need new infrastructure, there's no NIMBY issues, so that entitlement process is already complete. And preservation really is a neighborhood stabilization benefit also, has that benefit also. It reduces potential involuntary displacement and really helps maintain that neighborhood stability and character and the diversity of the neighborhood as well. Next slide, please. So that was a situation we found ourselves in 2016. We knew these units were being lost. We didn't have a coordinated strategy for preserving that long-term affordability. We really didn't at the time know what the subsidized inventory was in Colorado. There's many restricting agencies. And Colorado, as you know, at that time, 5 years ago or so, it was, as it has been until recently maybe, the markets were booming, so these increasing property values were really making preservation a lot more difficult. And as I said, we really just didn't have a strategy for addressing that. Next. So we brought together a core group really in response to these affordable housing pressures. We worked and formed the Colorado Housing Preservation Network in 2016, really with a goal to advocate for more coordinated preservation efforts and try and implement that statewide strategy for preserving those existing affordable rental housing units. In our Housing Preservation Network, of course, is CHAFA, the HUD, the Denver field office for this region is part of it, the Division of Housing, of course. We have some local jurisdictions as part of it, such as Denver, Colorado Springs, Adams counties, housing authorities, housing nonprofits, and of course, Enterprise was a key partner in establishing the network in the first place, and also as we are continuing this preservation work. It was felt like the first need that we really had was to create this master database so that we could track the inventory of these subsidized affordable housing units and really help assist us in identifying these at-risk properties. And we also developed a work plan at the time, and we've been implementing that since late 2016, 2017. So the organizations really have come together to form this partnership and develop and pursue preservation strategies. Next slide, please. So let's talk about what's in the database a little bit. It's really the foundation to help inform our strategies and priorities. And it's really the cornerstone of our efforts. And it's kind of an early warning system. It has HUD data, Section 8 properties, for example. It has CHAFA LIHTC information, loan information, division of housing. We do have some limited USDA info in there. City and County of Denver is a big restricting agency, so there's information from them in there. So as you can see here, we have about 1,400 properties in it right now, 70,000 affordable units, subsidized units. We have a variety of data on those, what restrictions there are, when those restrictions are expiring, different property and owner information, and we also have information, for example, or we have these 250 properties that are on sort of the highest priority list, and about 8,100 affordable units there. And you can see that's really just those with all the expiration dates are expiring within 5 years. And we also have mod rehab properties on there. That's a type of Section 8. It's a sort of an orphan HUD program. And those contracts renew once a year. And they have very limited ability to increase rents. So we consider those at high risk for converting to market. And also those 4% LIHTC deals that are past their compliance period, they can, once they get to a certain point, they may be able to exit the LIHTC program before their 30-year period. So we consider them higher risk. So that's an overview of some of the properties on the list right now. Next slide, please. So here you can see this is our main landing page, and we use a Tableau analytics platform there. And this is showing all the properties that have received or do currently receive some sort of subsidy or restriction. So you can see the majority are in the 7-county Denver metro area and really along the Front Range in general. But you can see there are affordable housing projects. They're really widely distributed throughout the state. So you can hover on a dot and get property information or click on it for more detail. And as I mentioned, we have the expiration dates and types, whether the owner is profit motivated or not. Is it a senior unit? Is it a family unit? Does it serve special populations? You can see over on the right there, you can sort by, say, county. I can pull up just whatever is in X county or Y city. We have bedroom counts, AMI levels. Now, the partners in the network do have access to this data, so we don't publicly share the data. We do publicly share a stripped down version of this data on our CHAFA website. We don't want to share the expiration dates widely and let perhaps people who are interested in converting to market to say, hey, this property is losing its restrictions next year. Let's see if we can buy that. So we don't like to publicly share it, but as I said, the partners do have access, and I do share localized information with jurisdictions and other potential partners. So I'd be happy if you were interested in what was going on in your county or your city or your area, be happy to share some of that information with you. Next slide, please. So this again just shows some more ways to sort it. I took out Metro Denver here, and I also took out Larimer County and El Paso County. So there's about 400 properties then left remaining with approximately 12,500 affordable units. You can still see there's some concentrations in Grand Junction and Durango and Greeley and Pueblo. But again, I mean, I think it's pretty, there's definitely a big distribution across the state. And you can see there, the blue are LIHTC properties, the orange are Section 8 properties, lighter orange division of housing, and so on. You can see the purple, we've got some USDA housing in there. Next slide, please. And just showing you some more shots of what we can do with it. As I said, we can slice it and dice it in many ways. You can see that the LIHTC is the blue, it's the most prevalent, then Section 8, then Division of Housing. I can export all this data and manipulate it, and that's often, as I said, what I share with people around the state. Next slide, please. And then you can also pull up detail on it. You can see, for example, this property has a couple of, it has LIHTC restrictions. It also has local government restrictions. And you can see it shows the bedroom mix and the AMI mix. And this one's going till 2053, so I'm not too worried about this one, but it's good information. Next slide, please. So we really have developed, we feel, this comprehensive database of the subsidized inventory across the state. We have this sort of institutionalization of this structure for preservation work. And in addition to working to preserve units and creating this preservation catalog, we do work with local governments across the state or housing authorities or other housing stakeholders that might be interested. We do engage in a variety of owner outreach. So we've done interviews and surveys with owners on plans or type of assistance needed, or do they have interest in selling or extending their restrictions, and trying to connect them with available resources or information. We do try and share policy options and best practices in different ways. So for example, preservation ordinance that City of Denver happens to have, and other cities and states across the country do have. This is where a jurisdiction has the right of first refusal when a subsidized property is going to be sold. And these preservation ordinances often require notice to tenants of that sale as well. So try and share information about best practices like that in preservation or land trust. And as I said, to disseminate the localized database information to jurisdictions and other people. And we're also part of a national group, the Preservation Working Group, which is convened by the National Housing Trust. And that lets us hear and participate in some of these national preservation discussions. Next slide, please. So we have had some successes, we think, since the network was established in late 2016 through last year. We've been able to preserve over 15,000 units, and that's about 20% of our inventory of 70,000 subsidized affordable housing units. So that's been pretty successful. This mod rehab workshop, I mentioned mod rehab is a special concern for preservation. So we did this intensive workshop with HUD and owners to try and work with them on trying to preserve their properties under the RAD program that HUD has. We've talked about mobile home parks a little bit in the earlier Division of Housing presentation. And those really have become a focus of some of our preservation work as well. We agree they're a great source of unsubsidized affordable housing in the US and Colorado, especially in rural areas, resort areas, et cetera. They're a big part of Colorado's housing stock. And we have at CHAFA been able to, we want to support loans for the resident-owned communities model, where people who own the units actually own the park itself. And so support that ROC model or purchased by mission-driven organizations. So we have done our first ROC loan that Thistle Communities and ROC USA did for a mobile home park in Longmont. And we've done multiple workshops in different conferences and things on trying to preserve mobile home parks and ways to do that. We've got a partnership with Energy Outreach Colorado, trying to help disseminate information on some of their resources, and been able to use the database to target properties, older properties that may benefit from some EOC funding. And we were also able to, we were able to use the database for a Capital Magnet Fund award application that CDFIs can apply for from the Department of Treasury. So some of you may be familiar with Impact Development Fund, one of our Colorado CDFIs. They put in an application for a CMFI award for $5 million for preservation financing specifically in the state. And we use that preservation database in the application to really help make that case. So I think that was hopefully a big part of their success there. Next slide, please. So since we have talked about mobile home parks a little bit, and that is such a great source of unsubsidized affordable housing, I did want to share a little bit from Boulder, and they really have a very robust mobile home park preservation policy. And they also have shared some of this in workshops and conferences, but it really is, in my opinion, a best practice for mobile home park preservation. And they really consider parks a key part of their affordable housing stock. Some communities try and get rid of them, some welcome them, some don't. But Boulder does want to try and promote the preservation and even development of mobile home parks. So they have this special zoning, and they try and encourage the preservation. And they've supported weatherization, energy efficiency, I mean, a variety of things over the years, mediation services, community organizing by the residents, home ownership programs, landlord-tenant guides, a variety of things. So they are involved right now in a multi-year planning and development process with one of the parks there, Ponderosa Mobile Home Park, which you see a picture of here. They purchased the property, the city did, they annexed it into the city, it was in the county, and they are working with the residents to really plan for the future of the park and what can be done. And the last I have heard is that they are working with the Flatirons Habitat for Humanity and are looking towards replacing units with modular units and combining it with that habitat model of sweat equity too. So they really have done a lot for trying to preserve mobile home parks in Boulder. Next slide, please. So some of the other things we're working right now, we did have that success with the Capital Magnet Fund application, but we're hoping to, if we can expand resources for preservation and perhaps attract other investors to this space and even better utilize what existing resources we have. Who knows with the current situation we're in, how successful we'll be, but we're working on it. For example, can we provide quicker capital to compete better in the market to secure some of these properties and preserve them? Or are there new products we can have to help assist smaller properties, such as those under 50 units, those naturally occurring affordable housing properties as well? So we're hoping to develop more of this funding for preservation and more flexible funding to really help compete on these preservation transactions for all sizes of projects and subsidized or unsubsidized. And we also like to see if we can support community land trusts as well for single family preservation. So we do right now have a revolving loan fund with one community land trust in Colorado that they can use to purchase and rehab and then resell the units and put them in their land trust. So we've done that for one, but we'd like to look at perhaps doing that for more. And housing authorities often have scattered site units, which many of them want to sell from their portfolios. So we're looking at a potential line of credit for another land trust to perhaps purchase some scattered site units. So it'd be great if we could get into that a little bit more and really do some single family housing preservation, ramp that up a little bit more. So that's it for me. The next slide, I think, is just the finished slide. And happy to entertain any questions, or as I said, work with local groups on what we have in what we show in the inventory in their areas. Thanks.
Thank you, Beth, so much. That's great. I'm so excited that we have this preservation database that's in the state that includes all types of housing stock and is statewide. And I'm sure that there'll be people who want to drill down a little bit more in their communities as we move through with the Rural Preservation Academy as well. I'm going to turn it over to Susan Anderson, who is our Senior Director for Rural and Native American Programs, and she's going to kind of moderate the questions for us. And we have a few questions coming through chat for the whole panel, so we might round robin your answers as that comes through. Susan, take it away.
Thanks, Robin, and just thanks to Beth and Wendy and Connor for your presentations today. And again, reminder, if you have additional questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box, or I believe we're going to open up the Q&A. And so we have had some questions come in already, and specifically wanted to know a question and also a statement from Shelley, sort of starting off noting, you know, policy efforts that Oregon has underway or have had in Oregon for quite some time, explicitly around the 515 portfolio and owners that are looking to opt out of that program and the process that they have to follow to give notice for sale. So just to on that note, recognizing that we will have an upcoming policy session as part of the Rural Rental Housing Preservation Academy, looking at best practices from other states and thinking about what might be implemented for the state of Colorado. But great point, thanks for bringing that up, Shelley. And then the other thing that she was interested in is, you know, a lot of the language used today has really been around nonprofits or housing authorities, local governments, and interested in people's appetite for partnering with for-profits. And I will say that from the Preservation Academy perspective, certainly we recognize the role for profits in this work too, and that's part of why these sessions that we'll do as today and moving forward are certainly open to all stakeholders interested in supporting preservation efforts. But I'll certainly let Beth or Wendy speak to that too, but no, they also work with many organizations that are just really concerned with making affordable housing happen.
Yeah, I mean, agreed, Susan. We're happy to work with anybody who wants to do preservation. So, of course, one and all would be welcome. We are very sensitive about sharing the data. So we wouldn't necessarily share a full list of all the properties and all the information that we have. But of course, we would love to work with anybody who wants to be interested in preservation. And we do share some parts of the data. We would be happy to share some parts of the data as well with anyone. And we certainly would be interested if there is, if we want to talk in the policy discussions, happy to participate in that, about a statewide preservation ordinance. I mean, that would be so great if we could do something like that. That would be a real benefit to the state.
And I'll just jump in too. If I left out for-profit developers in my description of stakeholders, that was totally unintentional. I mean, we had a lot of for-profit developers come to our stakeholder meetings. In fact, in the Denver area, we had kind of whole tables of developers to talk through some of the issues. And a lot of our gap financing goes to private developers as well. So we know that private developers are an important part of the picture.
Great, yeah, thank you, Beth and Wendy. And just echo that, we know that it takes all different types of stakeholders to meet the needs of our communities and their housing needs. One other quick question from Shelley was just more explicitly about the database and if it explicitly tracks USDA's 515 housing projects that are either eligible to prepay or have their mortgages coming up for expiration. So Beth, I know you touched on that a little bit, but I don't know if you want to.
We do have some USDA properties in our database. We haven't gotten it directly from USDA, but we have gone onto the USDA website and downloaded it. And we don't have the full USDA information in there. And I know, at least I think, Philip is going to be talking with the group at some point later. So I didn't want to get into that too much because to defer to Philip. But we do have some USDA projects on there, and we do have the expiration dates, and we do see that. And we do work with USDA on trying to preserve properties as well.
Great. Thanks,
Thanks
Beth.
for the plug, Beth. 2 weeks from today, May 19th, we'll be talking about USDA 515 transfers with Philip Dawson, who's the housing director from USDA for the state of Colorado, and Larry Anderson from USDA Done Right, who is a former housing director for National USDA RD office. And both of them can talk to us about the ins and outs and the excitement of a 515 transfer. So that registration will go out either this afternoon or tomorrow, so be on the lookout.
Yes, stay tuned for that. Reed asks, I've been told there will be funds in CARES or CARES 2 for shovel-ready projects. Can anyone touch on that? So certainly welcome Jenny or others to weigh in on, what they're hearing about that and what they foresee as those funds roll out and become available.
I have not heard that shovel-ready term in any of the advocacy for CARES 2 funding. Wendy, I don't know if you have.
I haven't heard that either. That, like you said, that term being passed around. How about you, Connor? Just pass the.
Yeah, I know as far as CARES 2, I haven't seen any introduced text for that. So I don't know if I can give too much insight on that new law as far as the original CARES Act. The increased funding for the block grant programs isn't the most usable block grant funds for the new construction or rehabilitation of housing. I know that CDBG and ESG are not used as often as, say, home or HTF funds for housing development and redevelopment. So that's a challenge.
The two things that I've heard about are, as I was saying earlier, the $48 million that we're advocating for in home funds, which can be used for new construction, the tax credit changes, and then there's a push for some additional CDBG. But the other push has been for more of the emergency solutions grant funds or more emergency housing assistance. So I have not heard necessarily anything about shovel-ready projects in those tranches of funds. Certainly HUD is providing some waivers to some of the rules that they have, or are proposing some waivers to make things a little bit easier, with inspections and other things like that, and some of the income verification, but not necessarily prioritizing where a project is in a pipeline, I would say. Maybe there's some advocacy that we haven't heard about, but that hasn't been anything that we've necessarily been tracking.
And the only thing that I'll really add to any of that is, I know that there's been sort of a push or thinking to get some infrastructure funding into the next sort of stimulus package or CARES 2 that includes housing. And just to share what I've heard is even that may be tampered a little bit at this point. And so that may even be CARES 3 version. So I think, from what I'm hearing and my understanding is really a lot of what's the focus is now is just on immediate needs around rental assistance and taking care of tenants and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's right. Some of those recovery efforts, especially around infrastructure, keep getting pushed back.
Yeah. So Larry has a great question and another plug for our next session. Larry will be one of the panelists for that session. And how can you not join a session with somebody that has a company called Get RD Done Right? But Larry asks, if a project is on CHAFA's 250 project priority list, what does that mean? And is there a priority for funding with that?
So if it's on the higher prioritization list just means it falls into one of those categories that I mentioned. So that means every affordability period expires within the next 5 years, primarily. That's mainly what they are, because there's not too many of the 4% that can reach that are eligible to exercise their qualified contract option and exit the program. And there's not a lot of mod rehab projects. There's only 30 mod rehab projects in the whole state, around 30. So it's primarily, that 250 is primarily those that everything is expiring in the next 5 years. So that doesn't mean that that it's definitely going to convert to market, or it needs this or it needs that, or it's going to get this or that. It just means that, hey, if everything's expiring in the next 5 years, we want to take a look at it. And so we do drill down on that list and look at it. So for example, if a housing authority owns it, I might not be worried that it's going to convert to market, but that doesn't mean it's not going to still need resources. So it doesn't mean there's a priority for funding, but it does mean that we are maybe looking at it more close, because 1,400 properties, I don't necessarily scan that list every day, but the 250 list, I can drill down on that a little bit more. And so maybe we try and do outreach to those people, to those owners, and see, hey, are you thinking of selling, or do you need some resources to recapitalize? So we might do outreach to them. It's not necessarily, it just means it's a higher priority. So if, for example, one project came in that was on that priority list and another project came in that wasn't, and we could only fund one, well, it might mean that prioritization, the one on the prioritization list, would get funding, but not necessarily if the other one was permanent supportive housing, for example, and that's also a priority, for example, tax credit funding. So it's just another way to drill down and dig into those projects that might be more at risk of converting to market since they're so close to their expiration dates, or it's another criteria that we can look at to see, is this a project we can fund or not?
Great, thanks, Beth. And I actually have a question that I recognize probably there isn't a ready answer to, but as we reflect on all the information that we've heard today, especially the input that we've seen from rural communities and their housing stock, as Connor pointed out, you even see in the rural resort communities, a lot of that housing stock is being bought up by cash, but then just an increase in pressure of rental housing in those communities, the lack of new development in other communities and the great need to preserve, and then also thinking through those unsubsidized properties that are affordable or NOAA projects, and kind of where we're at in the state of the world today with COVID-19 and maybe an impending another recession or depression. And you touched on this a little bit too with your existing product lines, Beth, but really just put this out there to all the panelists about where your thinking is on this in terms of, if there is a depression in the real estate market, of thinking through any opportunity to increase affordable housing with acquisition, and ensuring that that we don't see some of the things that we saw in the last Great Recession of private investors coming up and snatching foreclosed properties and things like that, and would just really love to get everybody's sort of thoughts and take on ability to be proactive to increase stock in light of what may come.
Well, I personally hope, we've all been saying this really for the last 5 or 6 or so years since the last, or since we came out of the 2008-2009 recession, and we've all been saying, hey, jokingly but not jokingly, hey, we need a recession because everything is so high priced. So I personally would hope this would be, if we were so unfortunate as to have a longer term downturn, that it is a buying opportunity, but we've got to have the funds available to do it. So if the state is having issues and others are having issues, that is going to hamper that ability. But I would hope that we would use this as a buying opportunity when some values are going down. So that is part of our impetus in our preservation financing work, is to try and develop some of those other resources. And that's a pitch we can make to investors that, hey, we might be having an opportunity now. And CHAFA, for example, did have what we called our RAP program. And that was where we did own properties. And I think from not the 2008 downturn, but some downturn even before that, we had taken properties back and owned them and managed them. We CHAFA owned the properties, but then, and it was a moneymaker for us, and we could keep them affordable. Well, then when the 2008, 2009 downturn happened, we were having cash issues, and we ended up selling all those properties. So we don't own that anymore, own any properties anymore. But we have been talking in the last couple of years about, hey, we should get back into the RAP program. And we do have more cash flow and more ability now. So hopefully, and we have sort of a RAP plan ready to go, but there hasn't really been a lot of buying opportunities anymore. So perhaps that could be an impetus for us to jump back into our RAP program. But I hope we do have the opportunity, but we've got to have the funds too.
Yeah, and like Beth said, I think our preservation, small multifamily preservation group that's been working hard, but so far we don't have a fund, is trying to say that, have the same message that, you know, this is a time where we need to have some additional tools to take advantage of those opportunities, or to think about it. And, you know, we need to make sure that we preserve as much as we possibly can. So hopefully we won't lose all of our state resources to the $3 billion budget deficit as well in the state, so that we can be leveraging some of the hard advocated for funds that the Division of Housing is supposed to receive.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add that that's also something we're just starting to think about. You know, the same idea you had, Susan, and going to be carefully watching the data for how maybe prices are going down, and like Jenny said, just, you know, depending on the money we have at the state, how we can get that out the door. One thing that's sort of related a little bit is that right now there's a lot of funding available for non-congregate sheltering. So for our homeless residents, to try to get them into motel rooms and out of congregate shelters just for their own health and safety. We're looking at that as the potential. If we are funding the purchase of motels for those things, how can we utilize those in the future? So if right now that's their purpose, but hopefully they'll become more permanent housing in the future. So trying to, you know, use this terrible situation as whatever opportunity we can to make things better going forward. So
well, thanks everybody for your response to that, and thinking about how we might move our collective mission for affordable housing forward, despite what may be impending. And one question that has come up in the chat from Steve is really looking at technical assistance or other resources that might be available. You know, he makes note of some of the resources that we have here at Enterprise, such as Section 4 or others within the state through CHODOs or the Division of Housing, DEVO, but just sort of asking, you know, are there other types of supports being considered for rural nonprofits, given kind of the challenges there are with time and capacity and expertise? Any thoughts on that?
I can add in one of those two bills, actually both of those bills that I described in the beginning of our presentation, which again, we're, you know, uncertain of right now in terms of funding, but they both included quite a large consultant line item. And our idea was that we would be able to deploy consultants to rural parts of the state to really handhold from, you know, the conception of an idea to getting a good application into the Division of Housing. So putting the financing together. So, I mean, that is still part of the plan as you know, as soon as we know about the money, and the money will come eventually. You know, we might just be on hold for a couple of years, but that was in those bills, or in our fiscal note for those bills.
We at CHAFA, we are also looking at perhaps supporting capacity building and technical assistance, particularly in rural areas of the state, a little bit more. We don't do too much of that now, but we are looking at that. We do have community relationship managers that are in Pueblo and Alamosa, and we had one on the Western Slope in Grand Junction who, I mean, many may know Karen Harkin out there, who left recently, but we're rehiring that, and adding one in Southwestern Colorado. And so they do provide some sort of technical assistance and capacity building, but we're looking at how we can expand that and maybe offer more. So I don't have anything to say yet, but hopefully there'll be something we can come out with this year where we'll be supporting capacity building a little bit more of a capacity building network and continuum, and maybe providing some more grants. I mean, I don't exactly know what form it's going to take, but we are working on that. And for example, we are also talking about perhaps smaller, if we're financing smaller properties, maybe reducing the compliance. It wouldn't be with tax credits funding, and it wouldn't be with federal funding. So it would be with CHAFA's own resources that we've developed. So it wouldn't have the same restrictions. So we might have lesser compliance requirements for some of these properties, and hopefully that would help with capacity issues too, but also maybe expanding our webinars or training on capacity building too. So we're looking at a variety of things like that.
Great, thank you, Beth and Wendy. And the other thing I'll add to, and Steve, you may be well aware of this already, but as a cohort participant for the Preservation Academy, a component of that is technical assistance that comes beyond just, you know, these sessions. And so if there's something explicit or specific that you need at this point in time, certainly I think reach out to Robin and get in touch with her, but also just make note that, you know, we are adapting this Preservation Academy in real time to make it happen. So just ask for your patience as we shift through all of these pieces and figure out how we put the puzzle back together. But if there is something explicit that you would like support with right away, just reach out to Robin. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Robin to close us out and wrap up. And before I do so, just one final thanks to all of our panelists for joining us today and the great presentations that you gave. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Robin, to close us out.
Yes, thank you. It's been a great session, and thank you all for being so adaptive to the new environment. That includes our panelists, but also our participants who were all in. We had, I think, 45 people in, and that was great to have you all participate. Thanks for submitting questions. I think some of my big takeaways for today are that 1 unit in rural Colorado is equal to 10 units in urban Colorado. You will be quoted on that, Connor, for a very long time. And also, for every new affordable apartment, 2 are lost. And so I think that's really highlighting the importance of our rural communities and doing this work in rural communities, and the importance of preservation in general. So really, we'll keep those kind of statistics with us as we think about this and the rest of the Academy. And please keep an eye out for that invitation for next 2 weeks from now, May 19th, the next session. And thank you all very much for attending. Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.